Good afternoon. I now call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment to order. First of all, I just want to know if everyone can hear me. Minister Thompson, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Jackie?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ron. Thank you.
ENR staff, DM, and everybody in that room, can you guys hear?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. My name is Ron Bonadrouche. I'm the MLA for Decho and Deputy Chair of this committee. Our first order of business is to open our meeting with a prayer. I'll ask MLA Ryland Johnson to offer the prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given the topic of today's meeting, I thought I would lead us a prayer about water. We in this territory are blessed with an abundance of water. We all in this room are tasked with a responsibility to protect that water for future generations. May we all be guided in today's meeting to help us fulfill that duty such that we have clean, safe drinking water for future generations. Merci, Mr. Chair.
An appropriate prayer. Thank you very much, MLA Ryland Johnson. Our next item is review and adoption of the agenda. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, committee has a public briefing with the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. Then committee will move in camera for an internal briefing on Bill 3 and consideration of a number of correspondence.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? Nothing. Jackie, you're okay?
Yes, sir, I'm okay, Ron.
Okay, hearing no changes, can I have a motion to approve the agenda? Moved by MLA Kevin O'Reilly. The motion is in order. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Having reviewed and adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none. Today, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is receiving a public briefing from the Honourable Shane Thompson, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, on the Transboundary Water Agreements. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels, and any presentation materials will be uploaded to the Legislative Assembly's website. To respect physical distancing requirements, the Minister and witnesses will be attending by video conference. I would like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions, and remarks will need to be directed to myself as the Chair. Both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the Chair before speaking. I will now ask members of the committee to introduce themselves for the record, starting with MLA Johnson.
Ryland Johnson, I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And we can get the staff.
Amy Lazat, Sketty Advisor.
James Thomas, Committee Clerk.
All right, Mussy for that. I will now invite Minister Thompson to introduce himself and his staff and to proceed with his opening remarks.
Jackie Jacobson, MLA Nunavut.
Sorry, Miss Jackie. Katrina, are you there?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, we also have MLA Jackie Jacobson online and MLA Katrina Knuckleby online. Minister Thompson?
Thank you, Chairperson Bonadrouche. I apologize, I wasn't able to, technology wasn't my friend today, so I was able to sign in. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. Thank you for inviting us to speak with you today. Here with me today from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources is Deputy Minister Dr. Elaine Kelly, Mr. John McDonald, Assistant Deputy Minister, Environment and Climate Change, Mr. F. Nathan Rickey, Director, Water Management and Monitoring Division, Ms. Megan Beverage Manager, Watershed Partnership and Agreement, as well as Jeff Ray, my Minister Special Advisor. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a briefing today on our transboundary water agreements and the high water expected this year in the upstream portion of the Mackenzie River Basin and Great Slave Lake. Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Water Master Agreement, which was signed in 1997, commits the governments of Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories in Canada to work together to maintain the ecological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem of the entire Mackenzie River Basin and to develop bilateral water management agreements. Transboundary agreements are extremely important to the NWT as we are the ultimate downstream jurisdiction in the Mackenzie River Basin. We have signed transboundary agreements with Alberta, British Columbia, and Yukon. Our agreement with Yukon was signed in 2002 and is being updated to be similar to our agreements with Alberta and British Columbia. The Alberta and British Columbia agreements were the first of their kind in the Mackenzie River Basin and were signed in 2015. These agreements help ensure the quality, quantity, and the biology of the water flowed into NWT remains healthy and abundant. As you are aware, this year has brought some unique challenges with temporary suspension of water monitoring in Alberta due to COVID-19 and expectations exceptional high water experience in our rivers in Mackenzie, and Great Slave Lake. The department ensures that the water monitoring was not only conducted within NWT, but also worked with the government of Alberta and the government of Canada to re-establish and monitoring at important long-term monitoring stations in Alberta and NWT. Those efforts resulted in Alberta reinstating water quality monitoring in early June, and the federal government reinstated water monitoring at important long-term monitoring sites in September. ENR's water quality monitoring results showed that in July of this year, suspended sediment and metal concentrations were higher than historic maximum, but by August, the conditions have returned to near normal. Mr. Chair, I would like to turn to Dr. Aaron Kelly, Deputy Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, who will take us through our presentation. With your permission, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. Minister. Deputy Minister, Dr. Aaron Kelly, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Minister Thompson. Good afternoon. Today, I will be providing information on the current status of Transboundary Water Management Agreement negotiations with the Yukon, Saskatchewan, and Nunavut, implementation with Alberta and British Columbia, as well as an overview of the high water levels that were experienced throughout the region and in Great Slave Lake this year. On slide 2, I will begin with a high-level overview of the Transboundary Water Management Agreements and provide an update on negotiations and implementation. I will briefly outline the governance structure of our agreements. I will then present some highlights and considerations for Transboundary Water Management Agreements, after which I will explain some of the benefits of the Transboundary Agreements. I will also describe the most recent information on the status of the upstream water monitoring and provide some results of ENR's Transboundary Water Quality Monitoring. I will then provide an update on high water levels of Great Slave Lake this summer, including some monitoring results from the plume. Finally, I will discuss next steps for ENR's work on Transboundary Water Management Agreements and the associated water quantity and quality assessments. On slide 3, Transboundary Water Management Agreements define how jurisdictions in the Mackenzie River Basin cooperatively manage shared waters. The NWT is the ultimate downstream jurisdiction in the Mackenzie River Basin. Much of the NWT's water resources, including rivers, tributaries, deltas, wetlands, and lakes, are influenced by management decisions in upstream jurisdictions, particularly those made in British Columbia and Alberta. Currently, the GNWT has signed bilateral water management agreements with Alberta in 2015 and British Columbia in the same year, as well as the Yukon in 2002. We are actively implementing those agreements in cooperation with the respective jurisdictions. For Alberta NWT implementation activities, since the signing of the bilateral agreements in 2015, Alberta and the Northwest Territories have been working cooperatively to meet the terms of the agreement, including meeting on a regular basis to share information about current and proposed development, implementing water and biological monitoring at the border, and reporting on the monitoring data and the activities undertaken to learn and increase our understanding of our shared waters and ecosystems. Our most recent bilateral management committee meeting with Alberta was held in June 2020. BMC members, Bilateral Management Committee is often called BMC. BMC members for the Northwest Territories are now Mr. John McDonald, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change for the GNWT, and Mr. Tim Herron of Fort Smith, who represents the Water Strategy Aboriginal Steering Committee. Bilateral reports are released annually. To date, 3 annual reports have been produced, which are available on the ENR website. Staff are actively working on the next annual report, which will report on 2 implementation years for 2018 to 2019. This report is expected to be released sometime in the summer of 2021. For British Columbia Northwest Territories implementation activities, for the BC NWT bilateral agreement, the last bilateral management committee meeting was also held in June 2020. BMC members for the NWT are again Mr. John McDonald, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and Frank Cochia of Fort Liard, who represents the Water Strategy Aboriginal Steering Committee. Recently, a groundwater drilling program was launched in 2019 to characterize groundwater in the transboundary area of the Liard Basin, but this work was put on hold because of the pandemic. To date, the BC NWT Implementation Highlights Report was released in November of 2018 and highlighted implementation activities undertaken from 2015 to 2018. Work on the next annual report is underway. Yukon NWT implementation activities. ENR and the Yukon have been working together to update the 2002 Yukon NWT agreement to make it more consistent with the recently signed agreements with Alberta and British Columbia. Because waters that flow between the Yukon and Northwest Territories are located within 2 distinct areas, the Northwest Territories and the Yukon have negotiated 2 updated transboundary agreements, one for the Peel-Mackenzie Delta basins and one for the Liard Basin. These updated agreements will be more comprehensive than the existing 2002 agreement, and ENR will begin consultation on the draft intentions document and appendices this month. Saskatchewan NWT negotiations. Talks towards a bilateral water management agreement have recently resumed. Our last meeting took place in early November. And for Nunavut, following the completion of Nunavut's water strategy, negotiations will proceed. On slide 4. To cooperatively manage the water resources of the entire Mackenzie River Basin, the governments of the Northwest Territories, Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Yukon, and Canada signed the Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Waters Master Agreement in 1997. The Master Agreement commits all 6 governments to work together to maintain the ecological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem of the entire Mackenzie River Basin and to develop bilateral water management agreements as schedules to the Master Agreement. As each Transboundary Water Management Agreement is completed, a joint bilateral management committee is established that administers its implementation. To ensure Indigenous interests are represented on each bilateral management committee, an intergovernmental agreement with Indigenous governments and organizations on implementation of transboundary agreements was developed in 2015. This agreement allows for the NWT and Water Strategy Aboriginal Steering Committee to recommend one of its members to sit on each of the bilateral management committees currently for Alberta and British Columbia. The Aboriginal Steering Committee recommended the following members, as previously mentioned, Mr. Tim Herron of the Northwest Territories Métis Nation to the Alberta NWT Committee, and Mr. Frank Cochia of the ADK to the BC NWT Committee. Once our agreement is updated with Yukon, bilateral management committees for the Peel-Mackenzie Delta and Liard Basins will also be established to administer implementation and will have membership from the Aboriginal Steering Committee. To ensure Indigenous perspectives both informed the final agreement and continue to inform implementation, the GNWT undertook significant consultation and regularly engages with the NWT Water Strategy Aboriginal Steering Committee. The GNWT also undertook public engagement. Given interdepartmental interests in water resources, ENR has informed and involved other GNW departments as appropriate in the development of positions and intentions documents for the NWT's Transboundary Water Management Agreement negotiations. On slide 5. The NWT agreements with Alberta and British Columbia have been used as models for the completed British Columbia-Yukon Agreement, as well as other transboundary agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin that are being negotiated. These bilateral water management agreements are nationally recognized as important models for modern transboundary water management. They've been recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization as a new generation of transboundary water agreements for their inclusion of traditional knowledge, creation of common baselines to measure broader ecosystems, and the valuation of ecosystem benefits. Implementation of our signed agreements is a collaborative process that can be time-consuming and challenging with respect to getting other jurisdictions to contribute information and resources. As these jurisdictions are upstream, the urgency in sharing information and finalizing reports is not always the same as it is for the Government of the Northwest Territories. Through the bilateral management committees and regular government-to-government communications, we are improving processes for annual reporting and sharing information. On slide 6. The transboundary agreements create a framework for cooperation and joint decision-making to maintain the health of the aquatic ecosystem in shared waters. The transboundary agreements help ensure that the quality, quantity, and biology of waters flowing into the Northwest Territories remain clean, abundant, and productive for all time, which is the vision of our water stewardship strategy. Commitments in the agreements include monitoring, creating learning plans, and setting triggers and objectives against which to assess monitoring data. For example, water quantity triggers, thresholds, and objectives commit the upstream jurisdiction to pass a certain amount of water. Water quality triggers are set at a protective level and are site-specific based on the long-term data for the specific river. These triggers provide early warning of change to the aquatic environment and prompt appropriate action so that effects are mitigated before they affect our waters. These commitments ensure aquatic ecosystem health is maintained and that all uses, including traditional use, are protected. The transboundary agreements include provisions for notification and consultation between governments on current and future developments that could impact waters that enter the NWT. These provisions are directly the result of concerns about development projects in upstream areas of the Mackenzie River Basin. These agreements also commit each government to discuss changes to key monitoring sites identified in the appendices of the agreement and require annual reporting on implementation activities. On slide 7. Water monitoring is a core component of the transboundary agreements. Monitoring of water quality, water quantity, and biology, such as fish and bugs, is critical to understanding change in aquatic ecosystems and meeting commitments in the agreement. Along with water monitoring done at the border, there are several upstream water quality sites and water quantity stations that help provide an early warning of potential change before it reaches our border. For example, Appendix I of the Alberta NWT Bilateral Water Management Agreement identifies 18 priority water quality monitoring sites and over 200 other water quality sites where Alberta has agreed to share their data with the NWT. Several of the priority sites are part of the oil sands monitoring program, which is operated by the Government of Canada and Alberta. On slide 8. Environment and Climate Change Canada and Alberta and Environment and Parks long-term water quality monitoring in Alberta was temporarily suspended in mid-March 2020 due to public health and safety concerns related to COVID-19. Water quality monitoring suspensions included their long-term monitoring sites on the Slave, Athabasca, and Peace Rivers, as well as the Hay River. It also included ECCC monitoring sites on the Athabasca River and its tributaries, which are part of the oil sands monitoring program. Once becoming aware of these suspensions, we immediately contacted both the Government of Alberta and Canada to advocate for water quality monitoring to be resumed. This included letters, calls, and meetings with government leaders and ministers to demonstrate the urgency. The Government of Alberta did not provide prior notification on their temporary suspensions and have since agreed to improve communication and notification. Their Deputy Minister has committed to quarterly meetings to discuss important programs such as our agreement and other areas of common interest. ENR's Transboundary Water Quality, Suspended Sediment, and Biological Monitoring Programs, as well as its community-based monitoring program, occurred this year with only slight delay. In June, Alberta Environment and Parks agreed to resume its routine long-term ambient water quality monitoring, including one site downstream of the oil sands region. Subsequently, ENR negotiated an arrangement with the Government of Canada for ENR to conduct monitoring on their behalf at 4 important long-term Environment and Climate Change Canada monitoring sites near the NWT border in August. The Slave River at Fitzgerald, Slave River Delta near the mouth, Hay River near the NWT Alberta border, and Peace River at Peace Point. The agreement included Environment Canada and Climate Change covering the GNWT costs to perform this sampling. In September, Environment Canada and Climate Change resumed its long-term water quality monitoring in Alberta and at the 4 sites noted in our agreement. By October, 12 of the 18 priority water quality sites, as identified in the Alberta NWT Agreement Appendix I, are active again. To ensure NWT interests are considered in future decision-making about oil sands monitoring program, the GNWT has made a request to have a seat on the Oil Sands Monitoring Oversight Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee for Aquatic and Surface Water. On slide 9. The NWT Transboundary Rivers Monitoring Program consists of long-term monitoring of 4 key transboundary rivers. The Slave River Monitoring Program was initiated in 1990 by the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs because the expansion and a number of new pulp mills were planned in northern Alberta. Oil sands developments were underway and expanding. The Transboundary Rivers Monitoring Program includes sampling on the Slave River, and the site is located at Fort Smith, below the Rapids of the Drowned. The Liard River site is located about 25 kilometers upstream from the Fort Liard near the BC NWT border. The Peel River site is located upstream of Fort McPherson near 8 Mile, or the ferry crossing. And the Hay River site is located off the boat launch at the North of 60 campground at the Alberta Northwest Territories border. On slide 10. Working with Indigenous governments and organizations and other water partners, water quality and suspended sediment samples are collected during the open water season and are analyzed for over 300 parameters, including nutrients and metals, as well as different kinds of organic substances. While some of these are naturally occurring, many are known to be associated also with human development and activities. Water and sediment are monitored for basic water quality, such as turbidity, how cloudy the water is, nutrients, which are parameters that can lead to algal growth, major ions, which include the amounts of sodium chloride and other parameters. Metals, the amount of aluminum, arsenic, copper, lead, mercury, and many others. Hydrocarbons, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which can be natural from seeps, but can also be introduced by upstream development. Organochlorines, such as pesticides, herbicides, and polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. And chlorinated phenols, dioxins and furans, chemicals that are typically associated with pulp and paper mills and incineration of waste. Laboratory analyses take time for these parameters, and the results are not available for several weeks after the samples are submitted to the lab, and then there is time required to analyze the data that is provided. On slide 11. With slight delays due to COVID-19, ENR staff continued water monitoring as per usual this year. Water quantity or water flow monitoring was also conducted. This monitoring is done at automated stations that are run by Environment and Climate Change Canada, their Water Survey of Canada. Water flow is measured by calculating the volume of water that passes a point in the river every second, which is known as cubic meters per second. Normally, the Slave River has an average flow of 4,730 meters cubed per second in July. However, this year, the July average flow was 7,449 meters cubed per second. This means that almost 7.5 million liters of water passed by Fort Smith every second during July. As a comparison, the Hay River has an average flow of 171 meters cubed per second in July. This year, the July average flow was 665 meters cubed per second, more than triple the average. On slide 12. Higher flows caused higher amounts of suspended sediment in the Slave and Hay Rivers. The higher suspended sediment load resulted in higher concentrations of metals, in some cases the highest levels ever recorded in the Slave and Hay rivers. It's important to note that although concentrations were higher than usual, they were not in a form that is readily available to be taken up by aquatic species. This slide illustrates turbidity concentrations on the Slave River in blue and the Hay River in brown. Turbidity is a measurement of the amount of light that penetrates a column of water and is used as an assessment of the amount of suspended sediment, debris or dirt, that is in the river. The high water this year resulted in very high levels of turbidity. This is particularly true in July for the Slave River. The Slave River graph on the left shows how turbidity levels changed throughout the summer and how they compare to historical averages. The graph compares the level of turbidity in July, August, and September in the Slave River to the historical maximum values for each month. As you can see, the levels of turbidity decreased as the summer progressed and water levels slowly decreased. Of note is that the level of turbidity in August and September were within the range of what we have measured in the past. You can see a similar pattern in the Hay River graph on the right. This graph also illustrates how turbidity levels in the Hay River changed throughout the summer. The graph compares the level of turbidity in July, August, and September in the Hay River to the historical maximum values for each month. As you can see, turbidity levels decreased over the summer as water levels slowly dropped from one month to the next. The level of turbidity in August and September were within the range of what we've measured in the past. The same pattern existed for many metals in both rivers. Results from August and September sampling will be made publicly available on our website over the next few weeks. It's normal to experience high levels of turbidity in the spring when the snowmelt and breakup occurs. However, this July, the level of turbidity was the highest we have ever recorded on both rivers. On slide 13. This table presents the results of selected metals for the Slave and Hay rivers. Arsenic, iron, and mercury were chosen as these parameters may be of interest. Dissolved concentrations of a metal are the amount dissolved in the water, like how sugar or salt dissolves in water. It is the dissolved fraction that is biologically available for uptake by fish and other aquatic life. Results show that while the total concentrations of arsenic, iron, and mercury exceeded the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment guidelines for the protection of aquatic life, dissolved concentrations were much lower. Therefore, the concentrations of metals in the Slave and Hay rivers this July should not have had any chemical-related impacts on aquatic organisms or fish. Health Canada's treated drinking water quality guideline for mercury is 1,000 nanograms per liter, and concentrations were well below this guideline in both rivers. On slide 14, I will focus on hydrocarbons. The Slave River is in blue on the left, and the Hay River is in brown on the right. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are chemical compounds that are present in air, water, and soil. Natural sources of hydrocarbons include forest fires and natural petroleum and gas deposits. PAHs, as they are known, are also associated with industrial oil sands projects and urban runoff. They are also used to make dyes, plastics, pesticides, and wood preservatives. ENR samples water and suspended sediments in the water for PAHs and analyzes the samples for 75 different individual hydrocarbons. Like metals, you can see that levels of PAHs in the Slave River on the left in July 2020 were much higher than what we have observed in the past. However, by August and September, levels of hydrocarbons in water were within the range of what has been measured in the past. The same pattern occurred in the Hay River, which you can see in the graph on the right, albeit on a much different scale. You can see that levels of hydrocarbons in the Hay River were also higher in July than what has ever been observed in the past. There are no results for the Hay River in August, as we were unable to sample due to the high water, poor condition of the boat launch, and field staff safety. The team considered launching the boat at Indian Cabins, but the Northwest Territories' 2-week isolation requirement due to COVID-19 was prohibitive. In September, the sediment load was too low to sample at the time of the visit. Where guidelines exist for PAH compounds, all levels in water were within CCME guidelines for the protection of aquatic life, consistent with previous results for both rivers. On slide 15. Water levels and river flow this year across parts of the Mackenzie River Basin have been very high. Water levels on Great Slave Lake this year were higher than we have ever seen. This has caused changes in the water quality as more dirt and sediment is being washed into the lakes and rivers. This resulted in a larger plume of sediment and debris in Great Slave Lake. In response to the concerns of the plume, ENR staff and community members from the North Slave Métis Alliance sampled the sediment plume in Great Slave Lake. A wide range of measurements and samples were collected at 10 locations in Great Slave Lake. 5 sites were located in the East Arm, and those samples were collected on August 17th, and 5 in the Yellowknife Bay area, with samples collected on August 26th. The results of the sampling will be made available on our website in the next few weeks. On slide 16, the results of the August water quality samples collected from Great Slave Lake indicated that some metals, such as aluminum, copper, and iron, were slightly higher than expected when compared to the historical data for sites near Dilo Deta and the long-term water quality monitoring sites at Taflini Narrows. Apologies for the pronunciation. However, results suggest that water quality should not have had an effect on aquatic organisms such as bugs and fish. Further, dissolved oxygen was measured directly in the water using a calibrated sensor to further address concerns for aquatic organisms. Dissolved oxygen results were well within the guideline values and near 100% saturation levels. On slide 17. Many Northerners are wondering why water levels are so high this year and what will happen to water levels this winter. Water levels on Great Slave Lake have been the highest on record since early July 2020. The blue line on this figure shows that since July, we've been setting the record for highest water level. At the request of ENR, a team of Environment and Canada and Climate Change Canada researchers have been working with representatives from the governments of the Northwest Territories, Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, as well as BC Hydro, to build an understanding of the conditions that contributed to these record high water levels. Several methods were used to analyze the data, and all confirmed that the combination of inputs from the Peace and Athabasca rivers contributed significantly to Great Slave Lake, with strong contribution from the Lake Athabasca region, helping to sustain the high levels. Very high inflows were also experienced from local rivers around Great Slave Lake, including the Hay River, Lockhart River, Tulson River, and Snare River, which all experienced well above normal summer flows, with peaks at or near record levels being reached at 7 of the inflow river gauges. The high inflows are attributed to exceedingly high precipitation between September 2019 and September 2020 in much of the basin, particularly from July onward. Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories analyses suggest that BC Hydro operations at Bennett Dam did not have a significant impact on Great Slave Lake water levels. We are unable to predict how long the high water levels will last. Rain and snowfall in northern British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and southern NWT over the next couple months will affect water levels. Water levels over winter will depend on inputs from the Athabasca and Peace Rivers, as well as outflows from Lake Athabasca, which has experienced the highest levels on record this summer as well. Water levels next year will depend on snow and melt conditions in the spring, as well as rain events. On slide 18. Next steps going forward for transboundary agreements include consultation and public engagement on the Yukon NWT intentions document, which are anticipated to begin in the coming weeks. The GNWT will continue to advocate to become a member of the Oil Sands Monitoring Program Oversight Committee and the Technical Advisory Committees for the Oil Sands Monitoring Program to ensure NWT interests are considered in related decision-making, and continue negotiations with the Government of Saskatchewan toward the establishment of a final bilateral water management agreement, as well as with Nunavut when they're done their water stewardship strategy. And for water quantity and quality assessments, next steps involve completing the interjurisdictional work on the contributing factors to the high water level on Great Slave Lake this year with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Alberta, British Columbia, and BC Hydro, reviewing the hydrocarbon data from the samples collected in the sediment plume, and initiating a project with the University of Ottawa for the review and characterization of hydrocarbons in the Mackenzie River Basin major transboundary rivers, the Slave, the Hay, the Liard, the Peel, the Athabasca, and the Peace. that concludes the presentation, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Merci, Deputy Minister Dr. Aaron Kelly. That was pretty detailed presentation. And we're hearing about so many metals, hydrocarbons, chemicals, ions and eons and what have you. I think it encourages a lively debate. Having said that, I'll open the floor to committee members for any questions. Mr. Ryland Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would look forward to ENR's sense of what role climate change plays in these high water levels. And when I see that Great Slave Lake is, at the highest water level ever this year, do we have any sense of that's just, a normal once in 50 years kind of anomaly? Or, I mean, when you look at water basins around the rest of the world, we're seeing more, fluctuation both in high water levels and in drought. Can we do we have enough science to say that due to climate change, that's something we can also anticipate for Great Slave Lake and the Mackenzie Valley Basin? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. Johnson. Minister Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your indulgence, I will turn this question to Nathan Rickey. Thank you.
Mr. Rickey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. Sometimes people will contribute to higher water levels or higher flow events to climate change. And one of the things that we need to factor into those considerations in the evidence is there are weather patterns that affect conditions in the environment on a day-to-day or yearly basis. And then there's climate considerations that take a much longer span of review. So given this year, we've had high water, we've had extreme precipitation events amongst the basin, but it's only 1 year, and it's hard to attribute what has happened this past year to climate change. But we are continuing to monitor, and if these patterns continue, then the evidence might suggest that there may be some shifting due to a changing climate. But at this time today, we can't attribute what has happened over the summer of 2020 to climate change specifically. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let's see, Mr. Rickey. Follow up, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I recognize that the studying climate takes, much longer than simply, a high precipitation year and the factors that led to this level on Great Slave Lake. I guess, does ENR have any sense of whether this higher level is something that we will see going forward? I simply don't know. Is the water level on Great Slave Lake increasing over time? And I think this has some practical implications. Should I rebuild my dock a little higher this year? Or do I just write this off as, a kind of once in a weather phenomenon? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let's see, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For that detail, I'll ask Deputy Minister Kelly to answer the question with your permission.
Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you're all aware, we've had several years with low water levels, and now we're having a high water year. But it's not just an average high water year, it's unprecedented conditions. So it makes it very hard to predict what's going to happen next when we have no data similar to this previously. So we recognize the member's question, and we're definitely working with our colleagues to find ways to try to predict what's going to happen, but it's very challenging with these unprecedented conditions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Yeah, it is unprecedented too. It's over Fort Providence there, the Mackenzie River is still wide open and flowing. Any follow-up there, Mr. Johnson? No. Any other questions from committee? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So back on slide well, I don't know what, sorry. It's in the speaking notes here as well. I guess for slide 3, the implementation activities, the reporting seems to take a very long time. The Deputy Minister mentioned that a report for 2018-2019 is going to be released in the summer of 2021. That's like 2 years after the activities should have taken or did take place. I'm just wondering, why is there such a long lag time between when things are happening under these agreements and when they're actually publicly reported? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
See Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson.
Thank you. For that detail, I'll turn to the Deputy Minister Kelly, with your permission. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The annual reports compile information on many different topic areas, including fish and bugs. With bugs, it takes quite some time for the samples to be analyzed and the data to be analyzed after that to determine which bugs are in the samples, for example. For water quantity information, it takes about a year for the data to become not provisional for us to be able to do our analyses. And for water quality data, it takes some time to get the samples back and also to do the analyses as well. On top of that, we need to agree to the interpretation with our colleagues in other jurisdictions, which involves quite a lot of work. And sometimes there are challenges with getting to a common interpretation, which has happened in the past. But we've definitely made significant strides to improving on our reporting and from a timing perspective, and we can see it improving over time even more. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Follow up, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I know that in the presentation, I guess the stoppage in the monitoring was characterized as temporary suspensions due to COVID, but when I went and looked on the Alberta Energy Regulator website, they were being characterized as well as industry relief. So that's the perspective of some of the folks in Alberta, was that this was actually an effort to help out industry. So in any event, that this pause in the monitoring, what effect does that have on our confidence levels moving forward? Because this monitoring has been carried out now for a number of years, and it does require consistency in terms of what's monitored and how often and reported on and all that kind of stuff. So what impact, if any, has this had on our confidence levels in understanding what's happening and projecting trends into the future and so on? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start and then turn it over to Dr. Kelly afterwards. First and foremost, I feel confident that the information that we were able to obtain and we were able to achieve by doing our monitoring did help us. Yes, there was a lag in some of the sites, but I felt comfortable that the information would not hurt the long-term data. But for further detail, I'll turn it to Dr. Kelly. Thank you.
I see Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's two different types of monitoring that we're discussing here. The monitoring that's done by, that would be under the Alberta Energy Regulator is regulatory-based monitoring. The monitoring that we're talking about here is long-term monitoring that the federal government and the Alberta government do. So the AER information was not for the sites that we're talking about in this presentation. So we use the long-term government data, and it's very important to us as an early warning system of change. But as the minister mentioned, we were able to conduct our monitoring in the territory. And so we have confidence that we understand what the changes were that occurred over the summer. It's unfortunate that COVID happened on this high water year, because obviously there are things that happened this year that have not happened previously, but we're confident that the data that we collected in the Northwest Territories will help us in the long term to look at those, how this is, how this is contributing to trends over the long term. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Sure, if nobody else has questions. So somewhere in the presentation it said as of October, 12 of 18 sites were active again. Are there still sites that are not being monitored or that were not brought back into monitoring as part of the system by the end of the season, or what's happening with the whole system? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For that detail, I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Aaron Kelly. Thank you, with your permission.
Merci, Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Environment Canada has a phased approach for restarting their water quality monitoring across Canada. So not all of the stations are back up and running. And it should be noted that not all water quality stations are sampled during the winter time when the ice is on the river as well. So we're happy with the 12 of the 18, but we'll continue to be watching this as we get closer to spring. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Katrina, you got a question?
I do, thanks. Somehow I've managed to join with no video, so my apologies. This may be a little bit outside the scope of this this presentation, so you might want to provide it to me later, but I'm just curious to know about with the dredging of the Hay River. Is that going to impact anything? I know we were unsuccessful in obtaining the funding for it, but obviously it's something that the government will continue to be pushing for. So at some point, if I could have more information on how that's going to impact the Transboundary Agreement and any of the monitoring, or if it won't at all, that would be great. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Knockleby. Minister Thompson?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll make a commitment to follow up with the member, but with your permission, I'll turn the floor to try to answer the question best we can through Nathan Ricky. Thank you.
Merci, Minister Thompson. Mr. Ricky?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess to answer the question as easily as I can, the process to dredge the Hay River for boat and docking would have to undergo regulatory processes because it's within the Northwest Territories, and it doesn't have any impact on our transboundary agreements that we have with other jurisdictions. But because it's within the Northwest Territories, there are certain regulatory processes that they would need to follow if that was successful and the funding was obtained to complete the project. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. Ricky. Katrina, do you have a follow-up?
No, that's good. Thank you for the presentation. I'm glad to see that we're back up and monitoring some of it, at least. Thanks.
Merci, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Jacobson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up on Ms. Knockleby's concern about the dredging. We do, if there's any dredging to happen, to make sure that anything that's going forward to the federal government, that the mouth of the Mackenzie River and the 12-mile marker into Tuck Harbor to be put on that list as well. That's just a comment in making sure that it's not forgotten. The question, and I just really would like to thank the minister and his staff, because it was always a worry for me in regards to the water being sampled up right from Alberta into to the end of the Mackenzie River. So I'm happy that's happening, but has there anything, like during this past summer, has there been anything in the water that's in the sampling, I guess, any concern brought up to our department? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll see Mr. Jacobson. Minister Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, in regards to the dredging, we will make sure that we bring forth that concern to the Minister Archie to make sure, because that's infrastructure. But in regards to the concerns, I will turn that to Dr. Aaron Kelly. Thank you, with your permission.
I'll see Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the unprecedented high water levels, we've received a lot of questions and concerns from residents on the Slave River, in Providence as well, and particularly on Great Slave Lake. And we've tried to answer and address all of the concerns that they put forward. It's one of the reasons that we're making sure that we're putting out the data publicly and as quickly as we can, so that it's available for our residents to have an understanding of why this is happening and what is in the water. I will say that from what we've seen, there were some exceedances to the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment guidelines that happened in July. That is usually when dirt comes into a river and you get these high water levels, there's metals that are attached to the dirt. Those metals, when they're attached to the dirt, they are not accessible to fish and bugs the same way as when it's dissolved in the water. And we saw from the data that there were high metal concentrations because there was high turbidity or high amounts of dirt in the water, but that the metal concentrations in the dissolved form were much lower. So we've been trying to get that message out, and we'll be putting some information on the website in the next couple of weeks related to that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll see Deputy Minister Kelly. Any follow-up, Mr. Jacobson?
Yeah, no, just maybe to get, when that happens, Minister Kelly, or Deputy Minister Kelly, maybe you could just send a note to us and when it's put on your website. And thank you again to the Minister and the staff for the hard work you guys have been doing. Thank you so much.
I'll see Mr. Jacobson. We'll just take that as a comment.
Mr. Chair?
Pardon?
Mr. Chair, Minister Thompson here. Yeah, we will make sure we get that information to committee for sure.
All right, thank you for that, Minister Thompson. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is in regards to the dispute resolution mechanism in the Alberta Transboundary Water Agreement. I guess I have concerns that it doesn't really give us a strong commitment that, we could ultimately disagree with Alberta. The committee has a number of tools such as investigations, making recommendations, but ultimately if there's a true dispute between us and Alberta regarding water quality or quantity, it goes to the minister, and if the minister in Alberta just simply doesn't want to follow that interpretation, it seems to me we don't have much of a ability to resolve that. And so my question is, I'm not as familiar with our other transboundary water agreements, but are there any other agreements we have where the dispute resolution either goes to binding arbitration or gives us a right of claim, or is there a more powerful dispute mechanism in any of our other transboundary water agreements than the Alberta one? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll see Mr. Johnson. Minister Thompson?
Thanks. I will start, and then I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Kelly. What I think people need to understand that this is probably the best transboundary agreement out there. It's been utilized. People look at it and see how we were able to get this. They give us, positive feedback on it. We've also gives us the ability to work with our partners, the provincial governments there. So I personally believe it is actually a good mechanism. Other people may not, but I think it's a tool that's been very successful. When we have concerns, I have been able to reach out to my colleagues, whether it's provincial or federal, and bring our concerns forward. And we've been able to deal with it with the Transboundary Agreement and the mechanism of diplomacy behind the scenes. So, but for further detail, I'll turn the floor over to Deputy Minister Kelly, with your permission.
Minister Thompson, Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The intention of these agreements is for them to be cooperative, and we look to the model of the Prairie Provinces Water Board agreements when we were developing these. One of the things that was brought forward to us by the Prairie Provinces Water Board jurisdictions when we were learning is that in all the time that they've had those agreements, they've been able to address any disputes through the ministerial process because their intention is to work together and because the agreements are collaborative in nature. What we made sure of is that all of our legal remedies are still available to us upon signing these agreements. So if the dispute resolution mechanism were to fail, then we still have legal remedies available for us to pursue if we decide that that is the way we would like to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I noted from the presentation, it was mentioned a couple of times that GNWT has requested seats on a couple of committees related to oil sands and other monitoring. What's the status of those requests? How long ago were the requests made? And is there any indication that they're actually going to, who ultimately, I guess, makes the decision about whether GNWT is going to get to sit on these committees or not? And when might that decision be made? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Hey, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start, and after I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Kelly. So I'd just like to make sure everybody understands that the department continues to advocate to have a seat on the Oil Sand Monitoring Program Oversight Committee and the Technical Advice Committee to ensure NWT interests are considered in related decision-making. The co-chairs of Oversight Committee have reached out to ENR's Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change to discuss our request. The chair are not against having GNWT involvement in the Oversight Committee, but they acknowledge that they have not ultimate decision-making. At this time, the establishment of the Oversight Committee has no process contemplated to add a member. The co-chairs are considering bringing our request to the Oversight Committee for the consideration. At this time, the department has not received confirmation of our request. However, for further information, I will turn it over to Deputy Minister Kelly.
I see Mr. Thompson, Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What we've been told by the co-chairs is that there's no process that's written into their structure to add members, and there are many member organizations that need to be engaged. I have one of the quarterly meetings coming up with the Deputy of Alberta, and I'll be checking into this within the next month, so we'll have an update at that time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Deputy Minister Kelly. Any follow-up questions? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, if you could keep us updated on that, it would be helpful. I guess one of the concerns I have is that with the high water levels, and the Deputy Minister mentioned this, you know, there was a big slug of sediments that came down the water through the watershed, and I'm just wondering whether that had the potential to mask some bad things that could have happened, you know, whether there was spills from the tar sands or, you know, intentional releases. Is that, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how the high water levels, increased sediments square with our ability to detect things that could have happened. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson.
Thank you. For that detail, I'd like to turn to Deputy Minister Kelly. Thank you.
I see
Thank you,
Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there were some stations that were operating upstream of the oil sands as well as one downstream of the oil sands and our monitoring, which allowed us to have a look at the turbidity levels. And the turbidity levels were high upstream of the oil sands as well as downstream. When we know of issues, there was one in the springtime where we were alerted that there was flooding in Fort McMurray. We put samplers in Fort Smith to make sure that we have the data available to answer questions like these. I think it's important to recognize that there's high turbidity levels every spring. Every time you get a flush of a system, you end up with high turbidity and often high metal concentrations that are associated. They just don't normally happen in July, which was this year was an anomaly for sure. So we've done, one of the reasons that we take some time to do the analysis is to make sure that we're doing a good job and really looking into the data. And we have some great people here at the department who have done that work for many years. And we're confident that the metals were associated with the dirt so that they're not of the bioavailable form like the dissolved. And we're confident that the dissolved concentrations were low and most often below guidelines. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Deputy Minister Kelly. Seeing no other further questions, or Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the Deputy Minister talked about metals. That's one of the issues perhaps coming out of the contaminants coming out of the tar sands. But I would have thought it would be more related to PAHs or hydrocarbons. What's our ability to detect those kind of contaminants upstream of the tar sands, and then with the high water levels, high sediment levels, knowing whether there was any spills, intentional releases, whatever, from the tar sands while the water levels were high. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Thompson.
Thank you. For that further detail, I'd like to turn to Mr. Kelly. Thank you.
I see Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the hydrocarbon concentrations, we measure them with our transboundary water monitoring within the Northwest Territories, and we've done that for 10 years. So we have the ability to look at trends, and that's one of the projects we're working on right now. But we can definitely say that the concentrations of the hydrocarbons, and there's quite a number of them that are measured, we're below where they have guidelines. We're below those guidelines even during the July sampling. I will also point out that we're working with the University of Ottawa for the review and characterization of hydrocarbon data in the Mackenzie River Basin on the Slave, Hay, Liard, Peel, and Athabasca and Peace Rivers. So we'll have some more information to share as that study goes forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Deputy Minister Kelly. And Mr. O'Reilly has a book full of questions. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the time here. My last question for now is, what sort of lessons learned do we take away from this, where monitoring was suspended during the highest water levels ever recorded, and the Alberta government didn't bother to inform us when they suspended some of their monitoring? What sort of lessons do we take away from this, and how do we improve the implementation of these agreements and look to how to improve the agreements themselves? Are changes necessary to better protect us? The other model that's out there in terms of transboundary water issues that I'm aware of is the International Joint Commission, where Canada and the U.S. Commit to not impact each other's waters, essentially, and it is legally binding and enforceable. I'm not sure that that's what we have in these transboundary agreements, but what are the lessons learned? What do we take away from this whole exercise so far? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Deputy Minister Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start and then turn it over to Deputy Minister Kelly. First and foremost, what we did start developing lessons learned, but I think we need to really stress that the transboundary agreement we have with Alberta and BC, and we're working with Saskatchewan and revising Yukon's, is these are world-class agreements. People may not agree with us, but we have been able to get a number of commitments from the jurisdictions that we work with to achieve a lot of stuff. Yeah, unfortunately, we weren't informed, but as soon as we were informed, we reached out to both the provincial minister and the federal minister to have these open and frank discussions, as well as our staff at the different levels. So we were on it right away, but for further details and answer Mr. Riley's questions, because there was more than just one question about what we have learned. But I will turn that over to Deputy Minister Kelly. Thank you.
Merci, Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll start out with the fact that Alberta, they did tell us when there were issues earlier in the spring with flooding in Fort McMurray. And it's unfortunate that this happened to be the highest water year on record on Great Slave Lake, but it was also the year of COVID. And one of the things that we need to recognize about Alberta is that they have multiple departments that work on these issues, not like ours where there's one department that is the main focus. So they have definitely committed to changing the way that they communicate. They put an ADM back on the Bilateral Management Committee to make sure, and that particular ADM is also responsible for the oil sands monitoring program. She's the co-chair, which is really good news for us. They recognize that this was a challenge for us, and that we had a case when we came to them and said that we hadn't been informed on this one. So I have definitely seen changes in the way we're interacting. The fact that the deputies now have quarterly meetings, that's never happened before with Alberta, to my knowledge, and that's really, I think, really positive steps. With respect to the agreements, these are cooperative agreements. That's always been the intention. That's what's written into the overarching Mackenzie River Basin Agreement from 1997. But there's some pieces of this with respect to enforceability that we haven't really spoken to because they're quite detailed in the agreement. The Slave River is a Class 3 river, and objectives are set to address water quality and quantity, and they must be met, and failure to meet them results in requirements to address the exceedances. And should those fail, then mitigation, financial measures, et cetera, can be discussed by the BMC. So I guess what we're looking at here is that while the water level was very high, and while we've had some exceedances, those have gone back down over time. And it's definitely something that we can look to in the future and have discussions at the Bilateral Management Committee and with the Deputy of Alberta, and we plan to do so. So we feel like we're in a good place with Alberta on the implementation. There's always a push from a downstream jurisdiction to an upstream jurisdiction to do more and to get this more on their radar, particularly when they have other water challenges in some of these jurisdictions. If you think of the southern Alberta, but we continue to do that through the Bilateral Management Committee, and we definitely are seeing that Alberta is responding to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. Okay, seeing no questions from committee members, I've got something that's concerning. I guess the whole point of this is just not to check the water for the sake of checking the water, but it stems from the fact that there is actually tar sands tailing ponds in Alberta, and there's no mention of it in your presentations, except to be the board. Because I don't know if you access any test results from the site itself, from the Alberta government. I don't know if you do, but and the fact that we know there's seepage, there's lots of stories about seepage into the main rivers from the tar sands. Good Lord, you know, we don't even know what's kind of chemicals are involved with the tar sands, besides the hydrocarbons and whatever else. But I take it you guys are just saying, well, it's dissolved into the water. It's dissipated somewhere. I kind of have a hard time fathoming such a scenario, because many times you're also stating that they're within guidelines, drinking or whatever. They're within guidelines. Just saying that alone, within guidelines, does tell me that there is something in that water coming from the tar sands, which is it's a concerning thing. And when we say it's within guidelines, okay, it's okay for people to consume. You know, the fish can consume them. You can consume, we consume the fish. I'm just wondering about the long-term effects of that. Consuming whatever meets guidelines over a period of time, years, whatnot, that will have on the human body. I just thought I would ask. You care to indulge me? Appreciate it, Masi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For that detail, I will turn to Deputy Minister Kelly. Thank you.
Masi, Minister Thompson. Deputy Minister Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the most positive things from my perspective about the transboundary agreements is that we get access to data in Alberta. And I mentioned in my presentation that for water quality, it's over 200 sites that they provide, that we can get the data from, so we can have this early warning system of change. So while we don't have access to regulatory data, so data that the companies are collecting, what we have access to is the data in the actual Mackenzie River system that are on the main tributaries, so the Athabasca River and the Peace River. And we can see and access data upstream and downstream of the oil sands. So we're able to track and look at different things that are related to different types of development. So we're very clear on, and it's one of the reasons that we sample 75 different hydrocarbons in the Northwest Territories, that hydrocarbons are associated with oil sands process. Another chemical is boron. There's other metals that are also associated with oil sands development. So we're definitely tracking that, but we're also looking at pesticides and all sorts of different chemicals that are coming from different things that are being done upstream. And all of it is to look at, are these things having an effect on the fish on the water and the fish and the bugs, because there's concerns for the people who are consuming them. So when I say that there's exceedances of guidelines, but that we don't need to be concerned, it's because there's different types of these metals. There's metals that there's total metals or particulate bound metals that are part of the dirt, attached to the dirt, and then there's metals that are dissolved. And the metals that are attached to the dirt, they tend to go downstream and then they fall out to the bottom of the river or the lake and they get covered over with other sediments. The metals that are dissolved, they can more easily get into the fish and the bugs, so they're the ones that we're most concerned with. And what we're seeing here is that we looked in July and there were some very high concentrations compared to what we normally see, and that they decreased over time, but the vast majority of that was attached to dirt that goes down the rivers and into the lakes and then is covered over with other sediments. So from our perspective, we've looked at this, and what we see is that there was that one peak and that it's gone down since then. So from a human health perspective, our comments as ENR, we don't, health and social services comments on health, we comment on ecosystem health. We're not concerned for the bugs in the fish, and we're not concerned for the amounts that are in the water. A couple of times I mentioned different guidelines that were for drinking water, for example. The thing we need to think about there is that when you drinking water out of your tap, it's gone through treatment so that it's removed a lot of that dirt. And there's recommendations from Health and Social Services that if you're drinking water out on the land, that you let the dirt settle to the bottom and that you boil the water, rolling boil for 2 minutes, so that you can get rid of any of the microorganisms like giardia and those types of things that are naturally in water. I'll also comment that some of these things are natural. So even hydrocarbons, when we're talking about them, they do come from oil sands development, but they're also naturally in the area, and they come from forest fires and other sources. So we need to take into consideration that these things can come from multiple sources. And when we look at the early warning system of change that we have, upstream sites, and we look at comparing them to guidelines, that's how ENR comes and says that we don't think that this is a concern, right? We look at it and we check, has it changed over time? Is it higher upstream? There's a number of different analyses that we do before we come and we provide a presentation like this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Deputy Minister Kelly. If there are no further questions from committee, I ask if the minister has any closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank committee for allowing us this opportunity to present and making it a public meeting. It was very good questions, and hopefully this information will help people understand what we're doing with the monitoring in our transboundary agreements. I appreciate you guys giving us this time today, and if you have any further questions, please get back to us. We're more than happy to answer it, and we've made a couple of commitments, which I know your committee chair or your committee clerk will make sure we follow up on, but we will guarantee we'll get that information to you. So again, thank you very much for your time and day, and with that, I'd just like to thank my staff, the DNR, for being part of today's presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Minister Thompson. I'd like to thank Minister Thompson and his staff for joining us today. This concludes the public portion of our meeting. We'll just wait till they sign off before we go in camera. Okay, well, entertain a motion to go in camera for the next portion of our meeting. Mr. Johnson.